DNA from two mummies has revealed a lost branch of humanity.
Finding these two mummies in the Sahara is like finding a time capsule that hasn't been touched since the dawn of humanity.
Scientists have uncovered the Sahara's secret past. That's something else entirely.
While the rest of the world was moving and mixing, this specific group stayed genetically pure in a way that seems almost impossible. They were trading tools and pottery with ancient civilizations, but they never shared their DNA. The lab revealed they are more closely related to people from the Czech Republic 50,000 years ago than anyone living near them today. It is a biological miracle that scientists are still struggling to explain. Laboratory results from Takarkori. The Takarkori rock shelter sits in a part of southwestern Libya that looks like the end of the world today. It is a place of endless sand dunes and rocks that get so hot they could bake bread. You can only get there with a four-wheel drive vehicle, and even then, the sun is relentless. But 7,000 years ago, this place looked nothing like a wasteland. Back then, it was a savanna that looked like a Mediterranean version of the Serengeti. There were permanent lakes, rushing rivers, and animals like hippos, elephants, and fish everywhere. Geologists call this the African humid period. It was a time when the largest hot desert on Earth was one of the most fertile places you could imagine. This is where researchers found the mummies that are currently breaking the internet. Between 14,500 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was a green corridor. It was a paradise for people and animals alike. In 2003, a team led by Professor Savino Di Lernia from the University of Rome started digging at the rock shelter. On the very second day, they found the first mummy. They weren't looking for pharaohs or gold. They found something much more valuable. 2 of the 15 people buried there had mummified naturally because the desert air was so dry. Their skin, ligaments, and tissues were perfectly preserved across 7,000 years. This almost never happens in hot places because heat usually destroys everything. But these women stayed intact, waiting for someone to find them and read their story. When the team started looking at the site, they realized these weren't just random people passing through. They were part of a civilization that had been there for over 8,000 years. They were pastoralists, which means they raised animals like sheep and goats. They built a real community in the middle of a green world. But getting DNA out of mummies in a hot desert is basically a nightmare. Heat usually shatters genetic material at the molecular level. Every single attempt to get usable DNA from North African sites like this had failed before. This was the first time anyone ever managed to sequence an entire genome from remains found in such a harsh environment. It was a technical miracle that nobody thought was possible until it actually happened. The team at the Max Planck Institute took DNA from the teeth and leg bones of the mummies. They used the densest parts of the body because that is where the genetic stuff survives the longest. They built a complete map of their DNA and compared it to nearly 800 living people and over 100 ancient genomes. Everyone expected these women to look like people from sub-Saharan Africa. It made sense because the Green Sahara was a wide-open path for people to move around. But when the results hit the computer screens, the entire theory collapsed. These women had no sub-Saharan ancestry at all. Zero. None. It was like they were living on a different planet, even though they were right next door. The crazy part is that even though the desert was green and easy to cross, these people stayed completely separate. For tens of thousands of years, they didn't mix with anyone from the south. This finding forces everyone to rethink how humans moved across the continent. It turns out that a green Sahara didn't mean everyone was mingling. These people were living in a bubble, and they stayed in that bubble for a very long time. It is a discovery that makes you wonder what else is hiding under those dunes. Researchers realized these women were part of something much deeper and older than anyone had ever dared to guess. Deep roots in the sand. Once the researchers saw that these women weren't related to their southern neighbors, they started looking for their real families. What they found was another massive surprise. The closest relatives to these mummies were 15,000-year-old hunter-gatherers found in a cave in Morocco. That population lived thousands of miles away and thousands of years ago. This means there was a deep North African lineage that had been living along the top of the continent for a very long time. Science had never really seen this group clearly until now. They were a ghost population. a group we only knew about through tiny hints in the DNA of living people today. This ghost population was essentially invisible to history. We had no bodies and no clear evidence of where they came from, until the sand of Takarkori gave them up. But here is the deal. When the scientists looked even further back, things got even weirder. They compared the Libyan mummies to some of the first modern humans to ever leave Africa. These were people who lived 50,000 years ago in what is now the Czech Republic. The results showed that the Takarkori women were more closely related to those ancient Czech people than to any sub-Saharan Africans. This is a key detail that changes the whole map of human expansion. It looks like the ancestors of these Libyan shepherdesses were part of the very first wave of humans who walked out of Africa. They were at the dawn of everything. But while the rest of humanity went off to build civilizations in Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, this group stayed behind. Or maybe they came back. Either way, they stayed genetically frozen for 50,000 years. Think about that for a second. While the rest of the world was changing, mixing, and evolving, this population in North Africa stayed exactly the same. They were like a living fossil of the very first modern humans. This kind of genetic continuity is almost unheard of. In Europe and Asia, people were always moving and mixing. You can't find anyone there who stayed the same for 50,000 years. But in the Sahara, these people did it. They stayed unmixed and untouched by the outside world while the world transformed around them. They survived ice ages and the drying of the desert without losing their identity. They left behind only tiny traces in the people living in North Africa today. Those traces were so subtle that scientists had to name them a ghost population before they even found the physical proof. The fact that they stayed so pure for so long is a scientific miracle. It means that the Sahara wasn't just a place people passed through. It was a home that kept a specific branch of humanity safe and separate for a length of time that is hard to even wrap your head around. But it wasn't just about their blood. Their way of life was also throwing a massive wrench into the way we think about the start of civilization. Nobody expected these people to be using high-tech tools without any help from the outside world. Ancient networking without breeding. For a long time, every scientist believed that farming and herding animals came from the Near East. The idea was that waves of farmers moved out of places like the Levant and physically brought their sheep and goats with them. They would move into a new area, take over, and mix with the local people. That was the standard model for how civilization spreads. But the DNA of the Takarkori mummies just destroyed that theory. Their genomes had absolutely no ancestry from Near Eastern farmers. There was no Levantine DNA and no European agricultural signatures. They were 100% local, yet they were clearly herders. They had sheep, goats, and cattle. They were living an agricultural lifestyle in the middle of the green Sahara. This means they didn't learn how to herd animals by breeding with outsiders. They learned it through cultural exchange. This is a huge shift in how we understand history. It shows that ancient people were trading ideas and technology without necessarily trading DNA. They were talking to their neighbors and learning from them, but they were keeping their families separate. It is like they were choosing to stay who they were while still taking the best ideas from everyone else. The researchers found pottery at the site that came from sub-Saharan Africa and the Nile Valley. And this proves they were part of a massive trade network that covered huge parts of the continent. They were interacting with people from all over. They saw new tools, new ways to make pots, and new ways to manage animals. They adopted all of it. But here is the catch. Even though they were trading and talking, there was almost no intermarriage. They were a cultural island. They took the knowledge, but they kept their bloodline pure. Johannes Krause from the Max Planck Institute said they were like living fossils clinging to their roots until the desert dried up. This challenges the idea that you need a mass migration to spread new technology. These people proved that you can have a high-tech society by just being good at networking. They were smart, they were connected, and they were very picky about who they had children with. It is a level of social control and identity that we don't usually associate with people living 7,000 years ago. This discovery makes us look at every other ancient civilization differently. If the people of the Sahara could do this, who else was doing it? We usually think of the ancient world as a place where people were constantly being replaced or absorbed. But the Takarkori people showed that you can stand your ground and keep your identity for thousands of years, even while the world is changing at your doorstep. But there was another secret hidden even deeper in their cells that pointed to a much older encounter. When the researchers looked at the molecular level, they found something even more surprising. These mummies carried Neanderthal DNA. It was about 0.15% of their total genome. Now, that might sound like a tiny amount, and it is. It is about 1/10 of what most people outside of Africa carry today. But it is much more than what you find in most sub-Saharan Africans. This tiny fraction of DNA tells a very specific story about when their ancestors met Neanderthals. This number suggests that their ancestors met Neanderthals during the very first great wave of humans leaving Africa about 50,000 years ago. They had a brief encounter, picked up a little bit of that DNA, and then they stopped mixing. They didn't go through the later rounds of breeding that happened as people moved deeper into Europe and Asia. They carried that ancient memory in their cells for 50,000 years. It is like a genetic timestamp that proves exactly where they were at the dawn of modern humanity. It is honestly wild to think about. While other groups were breeding more with Neanderthals and changing their genetic makeup, this ghost population stayed exactly as they were after that first meeting. They were a snapshot of a very specific moment in human history. They were related to the people found in the Czech Republic from 50,000 years ago, carrying the same faint traces of the very first human expansion. It shows that the history of our species is much more like a messy tree, with branches that go in all directions rather than a straight line. This ghost population sat at the crossroads of the world for 50 millennia. They saw the ice ages come and go. They saw the Sahara turn from a desert to a paradise and back again. Through all of that, they maintained their genetic integrity. It is an example of continuity that has no parallel in the archaeological record. They were a group that stood the test of time in a way that seems almost superhuman. They were a part of the world, trading and learning, but they were also apart from it. But nothing lasts forever. The same force that created their paradise eventually came back to take it away. They weren't defeated by an army or a disease. They were slowly erased by the climate itself. As the lakes began to dry up and the grass turned back into sand, their way of life started to fall apart. The world they had mastered was disappearing, and they had to make a choice. The end of their story is just as haunting as the beginning because it shows how even the strongest walls eventually crumble. End of an ancient era. The Takarkori people didn't vanish overnight. They were erased grain by grain. The single most powerful force on this planet, climate change, turned their lush home back into a desert. As the water disappeared, the ecosystem that had supported them for 50,000 years simply collapsed. The Green Sahara was dying, and with it, the isolation that had defined these people for so long. They couldn't stay separate anymore if they wanted to survive. It was a slow-motion catastrophe that took place over centuries. Imagine a world where the lakes you depend on shrink by a few inches, 7 or 8 centimeters, every single year. Eventually, the fish die. Then the hippos and crocodiles leave. Finally, the grass turns to dust. For a population that had remained genetically distinct for 500 centuries, this wasn't just a weather event. It was the end of their biological sovereignty. Gradually, the carefully maintained boundaries they had kept for thousands of years began to fail. They were eventually absorbed into the broader North African populations they had traded with for so long. They didn't just disappear into thin air. They merged. They became part of the people who live in North Africa today. But because they were so different and had been separate for so long, they only left behind faint genetic echoes. Until these mummies were found, those echoes were the only proof they ever existed. This raises a disturbing question about how many other groups have been completely swallowed by the dominant gene pool. If a group can stay isolated for 50,000 years and then vanish into the crowd in just a few generations, the history written in our DNA is far more fragmented than anyone wants to admit. And scientists believe there are many more mummies hidden under the sand. The Sahara is about 3.6 million square miles, 9.3 million square kilometers, making it roughly the same size as the United States. Most of it hasn't been explored by archaeologists. There could be dozens of other ghost populations waiting in rock shelters and caves, Each one of them carries a genome that could reveal an entirely new branch of the human family tree. Science is only just beginning to understand how much history the sand is actually holding on to. In fact, some researchers suggest that the Sahara is less of a desert and more of a massive natural deep freeze for human history. The hyper-arid conditions don't just destroy life, they preserve it with terrifying efficiency. These two women from Libya have done more to rewrite history than almost any other discovery in modern times. They proved that a branch of humanity could stay isolated for 50,000 years while still being part of a global trade network. They proved that civilization and technology can spread through talk and trade rather than just moving people. They showed that the story of the past is full of ghosts that are only now starting to appear. Before we go any further into the dark theories of where these people actually went, make sure to subscribe to Bravo Tango and hit the bell icon. We are constantly uncovering the hidden military and historical secrets that the mainstream media ignores. Your support helps us keep the investigation going. Now, the standard explanation, that they simply merged and walked away, might be the most conservative version of the story. There are wilder theories that suggest the Takarkori didn't just walk into the sunset. One theory suggests that the Takarkori didn't move toward the Nile or the coast at all. Instead, they went down. The Sahara sits on top of one of the largest fossil water aquifers in the world, the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System. It contains over 36,000 cubic miles, 150,000 cubic kilometers of groundwater. As the surface dried up, some theorists argue that these people followed the water into the massive limestone cave systems that honeycomb the region. If they had been masters of the desert for 50,000 years, they would have known where the last damp spots were. There is a possibility that entire communities lived in subterranean refuges for centuries, isolated even from the new desert dwellers above. While it sounds like science fiction, the discovery of complex cave systems in the Jebel Uweinat region shows that the desert has more vertical space than anyone realized. They might have lived in a world of shadows, utilizing the massive underground reservoirs long after the surface became a hellscape. Another theory posits that the Takarkori were the actual architects of the Egyptian miracle. We are taught that Egyptian civilization sprang up relatively quickly along the Nile. But where did the complex ideas about mummification in the afterlife come from? The Takarkori were mummifying their dead thousands of years before the first pharaoh was even born. They used sophisticated methods involving animal skins and organic preservatives that match the chemistry of early Egyptian burials. It is possible that the Takarkori didn't just merge with North Africans. They became the ruling elite, or the priestly class of the early Nile settlements. They could have brought 50,000 years of concentrated, isolated knowledge into a world that was still struggling to figure out basic agriculture. This would mean that the foundations of Western civilization weren't built by Egyptians as we know them, but by a ghost population from the deep desert that has been completely written out of the narrative. Their secret knowledge of anatomy and preservation might have been their ticket to power in a new, crowded world. There is also the matter of the Eye of the Sahara, a massive circular feature in Mauritania. While geologists say it is a natural formation, some fringe historians believe the Takarkori and other ghost populations saw the Sahara not as a wasteland, but as a grid. If they were trading across thousands of miles, kilometers, without moving their entire population, they must have had a communication system that defies our current understanding. Some researchers have pointed to the unusual placement of rock art across the desert, suggesting it functioned as a prehistoric GPS, or a series of signal stations. If the Takarkori were truly isolated for 50,000 years, their mental map of the continent would have been more detailed than anything we could produce today without satellites. They weren't wandering. They were managing a territory the size of a continent. They might have used specialized smoke signals or even acoustic mirrors in the canyons to send messages across hundreds of miles, kilometers, in a single day. The genetic data creates even more radical possibilities. The ghost DNA found in modern West Africans doesn't match Neanderthals or Denisovans. It is something else entirely. Some geneticists quietly wonder if the Takarkori weren't just a different tribe, but a different subspecies of human that evolved in the isolation of the Green Sahara. If a group stays separate for 50,000 years, they aren't just cousins. They are practically a different version of the human experiment. This would mean that the human family tree isn't a tree at all, but a tangled web of different species that occasionally bumped into each other and swapped secrets before one was wiped out by the weather. We might be looking at a parallel humanity that had its own language, its own religion, and its own physical adaptations to the intense Saharan sun that we simply cannot fathom today. Some even suggest that the Takarkori had a relationship with the environment that bordered on the supernatural. In many of the rock art sites, there are depictions of beings that don't look entirely human. They are tall, thin, and often shown interacting with the stars. While most archaeologists dismiss this as shamanic art, some believe it records a contact event. If a civilization remains stable for 50,000 years, they have a lot of time to look at the sky. They would have noticed cycles in the stars that we are only now identifying. Is it possible they weren't just reacting to climate change, but predicting it? Perhaps their disappearance wasn't a desperate flight, but a planned migration to a location we haven't found yet. The sand has a way of swallowing everything, including the evidence of high-level astronomical knowledge that shouldn't have existed 7,000 years ago. It makes you wonder about the world today. People think everything is figured out, but then two bodies from 7,000 years ago show up and prove everyone was wrong about almost everything. The Sahara is a massive graveyard of lost civilizations, and each time something new is found, the map of who we are changes. It is a reminder that everyone is carrying the stories of many ancestors in their DNA, even the ones that history forgot. But the most unsettling theory is that the desertification wasn't entirely natural. There is a minority view that the intensive cattle grazing practiced by the Takarkori and their neighbors actually accelerated the drying of the Sahara. If they were as advanced as their trade networks suggest, they might have inadvertently destroyed their own world through 10,000 years of overmanagement. They might be the ultimate warning from the past, a civilization that mastered its environment so well that it accidentally turned the dial too far and deleted itself from existence. The core principle that most people miss is that history is not a continuous line. It is a series of restarts. We see the Takarkori as a tragic footnote, but they were a 50,000-year success story. For comparison, modern recorded history only goes back about 5,000 or 6,000 years. These people survived 10 times longer than the Roman Empire, the United States, and the British Empire combined. They saw the ice caps melt and the oceans rise. They watched the stars shift position in the sky for 500 centuries. And yet, because they didn't build stone skyscrapers, we assumed they were primitive. The reality is that their technology was likely biological and social. They knew how to maintain a stable population and a trade network that spanned 2,000 miles, 3,200 kilometers, for longer than any other group in history. If all of this happened right under our feet and remained unknown for 7,000 years, what else is missing? The ground is far more complex than it looks. We are just the latest chapter in a very long and very mysterious book. And the sand isn't just dirt, it is a mask. Beneath it lies a version of the human story that doesn't fit into our textbooks. The Takarkori proved that you can be a superpower for 50,000 years and still be forgotten if the wind blows the wrong way. They were the masters of a green world that no longer exists, and their ghost DNA is a lingering warning that the same thing could happen to anyone. The desert doesn't care about your trade networks or your 50,000 years of tradition. It only cares about the rain, and when the rain stops, the erasing begins. What if the history we were taught in school is only 10% of the real story? It's crazy to think about how much is still buried under the sand. Do you think there are other ghost populations out there right now? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.